I'm Gleaves Whitney. I am proud to direct the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. I want to extend a warm welcome to everybody who's here this evening. You know, this is our first Common Ground event that we're hosting since the passing of Ralph Hauenstein. We had his visitation, I believe it was 5 weeks ago this evening. And it's a little poignant for us, obviously, to have such an event, and he's not able to be a part of it. He was such a fan of Bill's. But the last time, one of the last times that I saw him, I got to say to Ralph, you know, we're going to have a lineup of speakers this year, and H.W. Brands is coming back, and I think, you know Bill, and he said, I so hope that I can see H.W. Brands back in Grand Rapids. He just always enjoyed these. But he said, Gleaves, at my age, you know, you'd understand, I'm ready to donate my body to science fiction. Now, this is the 12th time we've had you at a Grand Valley function. Think of that, 12th time. Yeah. And he hasn't even said a word yet. You've got that kind of applause. That's pretty good. Bill, I don't think there's ever been a time that we have had you when there's been so much interest in American politics. This is the third round we've been through with the election. But I say that because Bill is going to be available during the Q&A portion of this to talk about anything you want to talk about current politics as well as Reagan. So make sure in your Q&A, be bold. You know, this is a great classroom for him. And he's got some interesting thoughts on the current situation. We just wonder, given what a crazy election year it's going to be and all the characters that are out there, who's the book you're going to write about, you know, for these, or maybe it's the whole group of them. You could write this wild book about the way things are going this year. But you know, one of the things that we try to uphold at the Hauenstein Center is a certain dignity about public affairs. Now, who's laughing at that thought? Uphold a certain dignity in our public affairs. This was very important to Ralph that we do so. And one of the missions of the Hauenstein Center is to raise our awareness of what it takes for this democracy to work. And as you know, we have a Common Ground initiative at the Hauenstein Center that we've launched, and it's gotten a very great reception because of people like you. People in West Michigan and Grand Rapids get it. It's the only way democracy can work, is for people to be able to reach across the aisle and work with each other. So we're going to remain committed to that because that's what Ralph would have wanted us to do. It's what we had vetted with him, program after program. He said, yes, this is the way we need for this country to go. And while I'm mentioning Ralph, I want to mention that two of his relatives are in the front row, Brian Hauenstein and Lily Hauenstein. Just stand up, please, so we can applaud. Well, in the spirit of Ralph would always want us to end on a humorous note, and I'm about to bring up Joe Hogan to actually introduce our speaker. But when I was reading Bill's book, Reagan, which is a great read, but there was one point that really struck me in this particular silly season that we're in right now. This was a joke that Reagan loved to tell at the expense of the political class. So I'm just going to read it as Bill wrote it and as Reagan apparently told it. An evangelical minister and a politician arrived at Heaven's Gate one day together. And St. Peter, after doing all the necessary formalities, took them in hand to show them where their quarters would be. And he took them to a small single room with a bed, a chair, and a table, and said, "This one is for the clergyman." And the politician was a little worried about what might be in store for him. And he couldn't believe it when St. Peter stopped in front of a beautiful mansion with lovely grounds and many servants and told him that these would be his quarters. And he couldn't help but ask, "But wait, there's something wrong. How do I get this mansion while that good and holy man only gets a single room?" And St. Peter said, "Well, you have to understand how things work up here. We've got thousands and thousands of clergy. You're the first politician who's ever made it." Joe Hogan, please come up and introduce our speaker.
thank you, Gleaves, and welcome everyone again to this evening's conversation with H.W. Brands. It's likely many of you recognize Bill, if not for his previous visits to the Hauenstein Center, then for his name, which is printed on the spine of over 28 books and counting. Twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, Bill is rightly considered a gifted historian and storyteller, one of a rare few writers who can use his deep and thickly textured knowledge of history not just to contribute to academic scholarship, but also to tell us a good story, as if we were all sitting around a campfire or crammed into his office at the University of Texas on a Friday afternoon. Bill's whole body of work tells much of the American story. His major biographies, taken together, amount to a leader's history of the United States, from Ben Franklin and Andrew Jackson to Ulysses S. Grant and the two Roosevelts, all the way to Ronald Reagan. Bill writes incessantly and in numerous, sometimes surprising forms. For the past 5 years, he's been on Twitter, publishing daily haikus about American history from the founding to the present. I'm not kidding. Right now, if you get on Twitter, you'll see that Bill's past 15 tweet haikus have been about the Vietnam War. This is just another example of Bill's ability to find new innovative ways to do history and to engage new audiences in the discussion of the American past. Considering the sheer number of words he has published, one wonders if Bill thinks of his writing as work or labor, as a job that is, or if for him it really is an itch that always needs to be scratched. In any case, readers are the beneficiaries of Bill's dogged commitment to his craft. About his book on Reagan, a reviewer in The Economist sums up critical consensus on Brand's prose. He is a, quote, lucid and witty writer who lays out the facts in short chapters that bounce along like one of the bare-fisted walloping action films that Reagan once starred in. Well, Bill is here this evening to talk about Ronald Reagan, a man whose name we've recently heard used as a battle cry by a number of Republican primary candidates, a president who is so often written and talked about, but perhaps not always understood. So please join me in welcoming back to Grand Rapids and the Hauenstein Center, H.W. Brands.
Thank you, Joe, for that kind introduction. I'm not sure whether I should thank Gleaves, because Gleaves, I was going to begin my presentation with a joke that Reagan told. And he told this joke to a gathering of evangelical ministers, and it was about the politician who dies and goes to heaven. But anyway, so you got us started. And I was actually going to draw a moral out of that joke. But I'll make do. But the first thing I want to say is that I'm delighted to be back in Grand Rapids at Grand Valley State and with the Hauenstein Center and as part of the Common Ground Initiative. And I hope you all realize what a gem you have here in the Hauenstein Center, especially in the Common Ground Initiative, because you don't have to be told that politics has become much more divisive over the course of the last 15 or 20 years. And it's really hard to find common ground or to find anybody who seems interested in finding common ground. And what Gleaves and the Hauenstein Center have done is quite remarkable. And it's developed a national reputation for the Hauenstein Center for Grand Valley State. And it's the principal reason, aside from having gotten to know a bunch of you, it's the principal reason I jump at any invitation to come back. You've got a great thing going here. And so congratulations to Gleaves on this, and thank you for having me back. So I am actually going to begin with a story, and, well, it'll be a different story this time. And this story is one that, like that one, that Reagan, actually, I have to say something, in sort of commemoration of Ralph Hauenstein. I got used to having Ralph, sitting in the front row, and he sort of would cast that that eye on me. There was a critical eye. He had a sense of humor, but I always knew that he had high standards, and I had to sort of live up to the expectations. And I was certainly sad to hear about the passing of Ralph, but I don't know if it was his idea or whose idea to have, well, I'm talking about Ronald Reagan, who's looking over my shoulder right now, but Ronald Reagan. So anyhow, so this story is a story that Ronald Reagan told about himself, sort of on himself. And it's a story that is set in a small town somewhere in the American Midwest. A lot of Reagan's stories are set somewhere in a small town in the Midwest. And this probably reflects the fact that Reagan himself was from a small town in the Midwest, from Dixon, Illinois, but also because Reagan understood that if you want to get at the heart of America, go to the heartland. If you tell a story that's set in Massachusetts, much of the rest of the country is going to tune you out because Massachusetts is quite distinctive. If you tell a story about California, people who live in Florida are going to say, it's not talking about me. But if you set it in the Middle West, then people, okay, this is about America. And this is a story about a part of Reagan's life that is not well known, and a part of Reagan's life that I won't say that he wasn't particularly proud of, but it was a part of his life where he just simply did not know where he was going. I will point something out, that Ronald Reagan was a late arrival in politics. Ronald Reagan showed no particular political interest or aptitude until he was more than half a century old. And the reason he went into politics, well, I'm going to explain the reason he went into politics. But this story is set in some small town in the Midwest. And there is going to be a lunch gathering of a local club. It could have been an Elks Club. It might have been the Chamber of Commerce, the Rotary Club, something like this, that meets regularly for lunch. And they try to get a speaker. Usually it's some local person, but on this occasion, it was this guy who would come in from outside. And his name was Ronald, and the last name was Reagan. And the reason I spell it out for you is that the person who was going to introduce him read the name on the program, and he said, okay, you're going to introduce this guy. And so he reads the name on the program, and he's not quite sure how the name is pronounced. Because quite plausibly, it could be Reagan, or it could be Reagan. And he doesn't want to embarrass himself by getting it wrong. He doesn't want to embarrass the guest. He's a polite, thoughtful guy. And I didn't tell you that this is sometime probably in the late 1950s. And the reason that this name, Reagan, is not known to this guy is that Ronald Reagan was not all that well known to the country then. He had been a film actor. He had actually been a radio announcer in the Midwest after college. And then he went from radio into film. He went to the movies in Hollywood. And he had a film career. But it didn't last very long, and it didn't go all that well. And Reagan himself blamed it on bad timing. Just when he had reached his dramatic breakthrough, World War II comes along. And the studios suspend production, and no good movies are made, and nobody's career goes anywhere. And so by the time the war ends, he's lost his chance. And Reagan was kind of overlooking a few things like, Humphrey Bogart and Casablanca that were, But anyway, by the late 1940s, his film career was fading to black. He couldn't get good roles. And, Reagan used to say, sort of looking back on this, he said, your career in Hollywood is in trouble, not by the people who don't call, but by the people who do call. People who 2 years before would never think they had a chance of getting you in their film. And now they figure you're so hard up, you'll go for them for anything at all. So Reagan's film career had faded away. And he made the transition from the big screen of film to the how many of you remember, I don't intend to really date you particularly, but how many of you remember the early TVs? You know, the little screens with the fuzzy picture and everything? That's where Reagan went. He went from the silver screen of Hollywood to the little bitty screen of television. It was a major demotion. It was a blow to his ego. And in fact, he didn't even become a television star. What he became was a television announcer. He became the host, and how many of you remember Reagan is the host of the General Electric Theater? Well, you remember, he shows up on TV screens for about 2 minutes on Sunday evening. And he announces the people who are really the stars of the show. And then he pitches General Electric. Because one of the things that people really didn't sufficiently appreciate is, those people who had remembered he had been in film. Now he's this announcer, but really, he was a pitch man for General Electric. That was his day job. And he traveled the country on behalf of General Electric. And he would give talks, I say on behalf of General Electric, on behalf of GE management. He would go around the country visiting GE assembly plants, factories, and he would speak to workers. And what he would do is try to convince them that GE management had their best interests at heart, and therefore they should not join any of those dastardly labor unions, and that they should be good and willing workers. And he would speak in other venues. He would speak, for example, at this particular lunch meeting in this small town where the guy doesn't know how to pronounce his name. So, this is Reagan. He's pretty much a has-been. And the audience that he gets, instead of the audience of millions from the TV screen, he has an audience of the 25 people who are going to be at this luncheon. And they don't even know how to pronounce his name. So, the introducer, the one who has this problem, he's trying to figure out, how do I figure out how to pronounce his name? You know, I tell this story to my students. And, these days you can find out anything on the internet. Including pronunciations of this and that. They go on YouTube and the whole thing. Well, I try to explain to them that there actually was a time before the internet, and they're not entirely convinced, but they'll take my word for it, maybe. Anyhow, so this guy is trying to figure out how to pronounce the name, and he feels that he is in a real quandary. So, an hour or two before the lunch, this is a small town, and so he goes out for a walk, and he's just kind of walking like this. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? And he has the program in his hand, and he's looking at it. And I don't know how to pronounce it. I don't want to get it wrong. And as he's walking around this small town in his neighborhood, he bumps into one of his neighbors. Actually, he bumps into the neighbor's dog. And because he's looking down, he bumps into the neighbor's dog. And says, "Oh." And the neighbor says, "Wow, is something the matter? You look like you're really distressed. What's going on?" And the guy starts to explain the situation, and then he just takes the piece of paper and he thrusts it in the face of his friend. "Do you know how to pronounce this guy's name? Do you know who he is?" And the guy reads it, the neighbor reads it, and he says, "Oh yeah, he used to be a film actor. It's Ronald Reagan." And the introducer said, "Now you sure it's Reagan? It's not Reagan, it's Reagan. Not Reagan. No, it's Reagan. Yeah, it's Reagan. You say Reagan, you're going to be okay." And the guy says, "Oh boy, you have lifted a burden off my shoulders." And I say, "Thanks a lot. I don't know how to thank you." So he sort of gets down like this again, and he says to himself, "Reagan, Reagan, Reagan." And he trips over the dog again. And he says to his neighbor, "By the way, that's a cute dog you got there. What kind is it?" "A bagel." Okay, now, what I want you to do is to just sort of remember your feeling. If you can sort of bottle your feeling right now, hold on to it. Because I've got a reason for this. Because it's going to be one of the secrets of Ronald Reagan's success. Okay? And I'll come back to that. But I told the joke just, to get a laugh, but also I'm going to draw a lesson out of it. So bear in mind how you were feeling when you were laughing at this. And also keep in mind sort of the kind of joke it was. It's not a, real, it's not a real belly slapper exactly. It's sort of a mildly amusing joke. And people chuckle. And it's one that you sort of have to, if you don't get it right away, then, you hear and other people laugh. Oh, now I get it. Okay. So anyway, I will be back to that one. But I'm also going to tell you another story, and this one involves Ronald Reagan only directly. But this is more directly involved with me as the biographer of Ronald Reagan. And I've been here at Grand Valley, at the Hauenstein Center, speaking about various biographies I've written. And I've probably said this before, but I will sort of say it again, because one of the things that I have learned about writing biographies, and it's probably worth you knowing if you haven't already figured it out yourself, as readers of biographies, those of you who are, that biography is a genre of history, but it is also a genre of psychology. And to understand the people that you're writing about requires making assessments, judgments of human nature. Because when you write, let's say, a broad history of World War II, the individuals, and there are few individuals that stand out, the leaders of countries, occasional generals, but you're talking, the individuals that you're writing about, they sort of shrink against the broad background of this world war. But when you write a biography, the individual is sort of front and center. And you probably, maybe you have to know something about sociology to understand the way armies work and wars and like this. But you really don't have a whole lot of time to get into the psychology of a single individual. But when you're writing biography, you do have to try to figure out what makes this guy tick. Okay? So, this story, as you'll see, involves me and my investigations into the question of what made Ronald Reagan tick. So, I had written an earlier book. It was a book on Ulysses Grant. And I was doing a book tour, and on these book tours you do lots of interviews, and I was doing an interview with a radio host, and I believe it was in Chicago. And so he was asking me about Grant and all this stuff, and yeah, that's good. And then at the end of these interviews, a question comes up, but it's pretty standard. So, Brans, what's your next book? What are you writing about next? And I said I was writing about Ronald Reagan. That was going to be my next book. And what he did then was, he put his hand over the microphone, and he said, when we get off the air, there's something I need to tell you. I said, okay, this is interesting. This is Chicago, this is Illinois. And the guy was of an age where I was imagining maybe his grandmother dated Reagan in college or something. And maybe there's some love letters that were found in a trunk in the attic. That would be great. I didn't know what kind of revelation to expect. So, we finish the interview, we go off the air. And I'm waiting to hear what he has to say. And he said, if you want to understand Ronald Reagan, you need to keep one thing foremost in mind. Ronald Reagan was the son of an alcoholic father. And I didn't know how I was supposed to respond to this statement. I didn't know, for example, if he thought he was telling me something I didn't already know, because I already knew this. And everybody who'd read either of Reagan's two memoirs knew this. Reagan was quite open in telling the story of his life about the fact that his father was an alcoholic. And so, not knowing how to respond, not knowing what to say, I didn't say anything at all. And so, I just waited to see what more he had to say. It didn't take him long to say, I speak on this subject as the son of an alcoholic father. And he said, I will tell you that when you grow up in this situation, you develop a characteristic emotional approach to the world. You develop a reluctance to let people get close to you. Because the person who is your emotional model, the person on whom you want to rely, the one who is going to show you how to be an adult, is the most unreliable, often unavailable person that you can imagine. One day your father is your best friend, and he's throwing the baseball around in the backyard with you, and he's telling you funny stories, and he takes you out for ice cream, and you think he's the greatest guy in the world. And the next day, he's beating the living daylights out of you. And every morning when you wake up, you don't know which father you're going to have to deal with. And so, you just pull back. You don't let people get close. So I listened to this, and I thought, this is interesting. This tells me something about his life. Does it tell me something about Ronald Reagan's life? I wasn't going to take his word for it. I was going to entertain the possibility he had given me some insight, but the facts about Reagan's life needed to either bear this out or refute it. So I sort of tucked it away and went back to my researches about Reagan. And I will say this about Ronald Reagan, that he was not a reflective person. He didn't keep a diary as a regular matter. He did keep a diary when he was in the White House, but it was largely a political diary, although I think I'll have some more to say about that. It became less political over time. But initially, he was writing for nosy historians like me, people who would be looking over his shoulder some years hence, and this was going to be his version of how his day had gone. So there's that. He wrote letters. He wrote lots of letters, but rarely to the same person more than once or twice. It's interesting, there are lots of Reagan letters available, but they typically are letters to constituents or to somebody he just met in an offhand way. And this is just a single letter to this particular person. And he's saying something about, well, when he's in political office, he's saying something about what he was trying to do. For example, in 1981, in the summer of 1981, Reagan fired all the air traffic controllers. And you may remember this. They had gone back on their pledge not to strike as a public union, and they struck. He said, if you go on strike, I'm going to fire you. They struck, he fired them. And he got a letter from the mother of one of these air traffic controllers who said that my son's career is in shambles. Can you do anything for him? And he explained, and he took great pains. Presidents are busy, but he took the time to write out longhand this letter to the mother and explained that, yes, he felt for her, he felt for her son, but her son had given his word, given his pledge, and gone back on this, and the president was responsible to all the people of America, and so he had to stick with this. But then, at the end, he said, but I'll do what I can for your son. And in fact, what he did was not just for the son, but for all the other air traffic controllers. At the time, there was a rule that said that if you were fired from a federal job, you had to wait 2 years before you could apply for any other federal job. And he waived that period. So, having made this political statement, this political principle, he could still sort of see the individuals involved. Anyway, so I'm trying to find Reagan, trying to find what is going through his head. And I said the diary's not a whole lot of help, the letters aren't a whole lot of help. But there were 2 memoirs that were helpful in this regard. Now, some of you may remember the famous line from the beginning of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Remember this about where he says that every happy family is the same, it's the unhappy ones who are interesting? Okay? The same thing applies to presidential administrations. And for the biographer, the best administrations are the ones where the members of the administration hate each other. Because as soon as they get out, then they spill the beans. And Reagan's administration was inordinately dysfunctional in this regard. And they all hated each other, and they all wrote their memoirs, and they told their story. But the last one to tell her story was Nancy Reagan. She had to wait until her husband was out of the White House. And then she wrote a memoir, and she called it My Turn. Okay, now I'm going to tell you, she's going to get back at people. And it is one of the most candid, I think it's one of the best memoirs by a person in public life in America in the last 50 years, because it is very revealing. It says a lot about Nancy. It says a lot about her husband. And one of the things it tells me, us, anybody who reads it, is that she always called her husband Ronnie. She called him Ronnie in person. She called him Ronnie in her book. She called him Ronnie everywhere. Do you know what he called her? Mommy. I say that, and I try to listen to the reaction. And I got a couple of, oh. I tell you, when I tell this to my students, the University of Texas where I teach, so these are 19-year-old kids, when I say, and he called her mommy, there's a universal, yeah. So, I'm not, at this point, I'm not going to go too far into, well, what does that mean? That he's calling her mommy. Anyway, but there's a moment in Nancy's memoir where she says something, I think, very revealing about her husband. Now, I will say this, that I have nothing but respect and admiration for the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan. It is one of the great love stories in modern American life. The two of them loved each other dearly. Each one was almost the sum of the other's emotional universe. They were as close as could be. When Nancy was out of town, she rarely traveled without her husband, but occasionally she did. Her parents lived in Phoenix when she was in the White House, and when their health declined, she would fly out there for a couple of days. And when she did, her husband, Ronald Reagan, Ronnie, would write in his diary, "Mommy is gone. I count the hours until she comes back." When he's getting ready to go to bed in his diary, he says, "This White House is so lonely while Mommy is away." And so it's very touching. Nancy tells very much about herself, about her husband, and one of the things she tells is that I was closer to Ronnie than anybody else, which is quite true. And, in fact, closer than the children. The children felt often on the outside of this. There was this very sort of tightly knit universe of two. And she said, but there were times when even I didn't know what was going through his head and through his heart. There was this curtain that would come down, and he would step back. He would remove himself. And I knew that I couldn't get past that, and I would simply have to wait. And then, in time, the curtain would come up and it'd let me back in again. So, this is one bit of evidence from somebody who knew probably better than anybody else that essentially corroborated what my radio host informant had said, that you develop this standoffish attitude toward other people. So that was one bit of evidence from a memoir. There's another bit of evidence, and you can decide whether it is more telling. I think in some ways it was. From another memoir, the memoir of Ronald Reagan himself. And he tells the story in his memoir of an afternoon in Dixon, Illinois. He is 11 years old. He has stayed after school, or actually he's gone from school to the local YMCA. And there's something going on there, and it lets out as it's getting dark. It's in the middle of winter. There is snow on the ground. The temperature is well below freezing. And he walks home from the YMCA, and he turns into the walkway to the front porch of the house that they're living in. And as he turns in, he sees his father passed out drunk in the snow. And as he tells the story in his memoir, now this from a distance of 75 years. He wrote his memoir when he was 80 years old. So 70 years roughly. He wrote the memoir when he was 80 years old, and he's talking about when he's 11. So it's a long way away, but he remembers the moment as though it had been the day before. Because he says, when I saw my father lying down, passed out drunk in the snow, I stood there and I asked myself, what should I do? Should I leave him there and just walk on in and pretend I hadn't seen him? And he lets the question sort of hang in the air for a moment. He doesn't elaborate on what the obvious result of this action would be. That his father would probably freeze to death in the snow. And he says, But then I decided I ought to drag him in, and so I did. Now, he ends up doing what one would expect. But there is that moment when he's thinking, maybe I should just leave him here. When he's thinking, maybe my life would be better if my father were dead. Now, that's a pretty heavy thing for an 11-year-old kid to be thinking. So, this gave me, I think, a little bit of insight into the kind of person that I was studying. Now, I'm going to tell you that every biographer has to solve the puzzle of his or her subject. Much has been made of what is called the enigma of Ronald Reagan. Now, I think that the people who subscribe to the enigma theory have the wrong enigma in mind, because they're usually talking about, so what was going through his head? What was it that made this guy tick? Now, I'm not going to say that I know exactly what made Reagan tick, but I don't think Reagan as an individual was more of an enigma than you or you or you or me or anybody else. And I think that the business of his alcoholic father and his reaction to that tells me something about him. There's something else that you see as a consistent theme through Reagan's life, and that is his search for audiences, for people he can get up in front of, and, well, people that he can make laugh, like you laughed when I told you the story that Reagan used to tell, okay? And here's another one that comes from Reagan's own testimony. So, when you are writing the biography of somebody, you read their memoirs, if they write memoirs, and you discount them for the fact that, well, this is the story that they wanted the world to see. Fair enough. But sometimes they sort of tell stuff that maybe they don't even realize they're telling. And so I think when Reagan told this story about maybe leaving his dad to die in the snow, I don't think he really thought about what he was saying and what that might reveal about him. But I'm going to tell you this other story that's related to this same time period, when he was a child. And because of his alcoholic father, because he had an older brother who was sort of, first of all, older, and being older, he was more capable, he was smarter, a better athlete, more sociable, all the stuff that younger brothers have to deal with older brothers. But in Reagan's case, there was sort of an objective reality to it. Reagan, as a young boy, was not well coordinated. He always imagined being a great athlete, but he was so nearsighted that he was a disaster at baseball or anything that required hand-eye coordination because the eyes just didn't work well enough. He eventually played college in football, but the only reason he was on the team was it was a very small college, and they needed every male body to be on the team. He was on the fourth string, out of 4 strings. And so his childhood was one where he often felt ill at ease, out of place, anxious. And he discovered that there was one part of his childhood, there was this one place where the anxieties would disappear, when he would feel, okay. And he discovered it one day when his mother, his long-suffering mother, the one who held the family together while her husband, his father, was getting drunk and losing job after job after job. His mother was active in the local church, Disciples of Christ, and she would help organize plays and skits and dinners and stuff like that. And so one day she was putting together a skit or a musical or something like this, and somebody commented on she had a cute kid. And so it occurred to her that she would put little Ronnie, the family called him Dutch because they didn't have much money, and Nell, the mother, would do the thing of putting the bowl on the kid's head and cut all around the edge. So he had this sort of little Dutch boy haircut. And So she put him up on the stage, and it's in his memoir. Now, he tells this story, again in his memoir. Now this is from a distance of 75 years. He's about 5 years old when this is happening. And he doesn't say exactly what he did, but what he remembered, because he didn't remember what he did, but what he remembered was the reaction that he got. He remembered that people applauded. People laughed. And from that distance of 75 years, he said, it was music to my ears. And in his memoir, at various points, he talks about the music of an audience's applause. Later, when he goes off to Hollywood, he comments on the fact that a lot of the actors that he knew in Hollywood came to the stage, came to the screen from some kind of similar background, that they felt more comfortable when they were sort of not being themselves, when they were being somebody else, when they could hear the music of the applause. And this reminds me of a comment that I heard years ago from an actor, and I think it was the actor Joel Grey. And I think it was on the Dick Cavett show, and Dick Cavett had a talk show. And the question was posed to the actor, do you ever get stage fright? And he said, stage fright? No. What I have is life fright. And there are a lot of people who go into this who are more comfortable in front on a stage when they are not going to be evaluated for themselves exactly because they're somebody else. They're more comfortable almost in somebody else's skin. Anyway, if you look at Reagan, you can see this trend from one stage and an audience to another stage and another audience. So he goes from the church skits and plays to his high school drama club. And then he goes off to college, and he's in theatrical performances in college. When he is in college, he develops the idea that he wants to go into film. He loves movies. He grew up in the days of the silent films. By the time he gets to college, the talkies are just coming in. People have commented that he's a good-looking guy, and he thinks, maybe I could be a film star. But he was hesitant to make the leap from Eureka College to Hollywood. So he starts with a halfway step. He goes into radio. And radio gives him a new audience. Now, instead of just the number of people who are in the auditorium or the play hall where they're putting on a college production, there are the thousands and thousands of people out there who are listening to the radio show. And then eventually he screws up his nerve to go to Hollywood for a screen test. And this is crucial because some people are good looking but are not particularly photogenic. Reagan was both. The camera liked him. And his film career gets started. And he was one of the sort of the B-movie stars. Some of you will remember the days when there were double features, and there was the main event, and then there was the B-movie, which is basically filler, so they could get away with charging you for the double feature. And it was like the farm leagues for Hollywood. And Reagan starts out in the B-movies, and he does okay. And he develops a certain knack for a certain kind of character. He's a good supporting actor. He wants, of course, to be the lead. But he discovers that he just doesn't have it to be the lead. In fact, when Reagan eventually decides to go into politics, and the word gets out he's going to run for governor of California, and Samuel Goldman of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer hears that Reagan has announced for governor, he says, no. Jimmy Stewart for governor, Ronald Reagan for best friend. And that really was an apt characterization of the kind of roles that Reagan did well at. There was something about Reagan, I think I know what it was. It was Reagan's distance from his own emotions that kept him from being a really good dramatic actor. Now, I've never been an actor, and so I don't know a whole lot about the psychology or the theory of acting, but I have to believe that in order to portray the emotions of an individual, you have to have some place within yourself where you can dig to imagine, to feel those emotions. And Reagan just refused to go there. And so he really could be a great best friend. but to be the lead actor, the one that's going to make you really feel the emotions he's feeling. Because he didn't want to feel them himself, he couldn't project them to anybody else. This is the reason, I think, that Reagan was only a sort of a supporting actor. His name never made it to the top of the marquee. So, I'm going to be so bold as to say that I think I've solved the enigma of Reagan the individual. I think I know what made Reagan tick. But there's a second enigma. And for the student of politics, student of the presidency, this is the bigger one. The bigger enigma is, the basic enigma of Ronald Reagan is not what made him tick, it's what made him successful. Because Ronald Reagan was not the kind of person you would identify in his youth to say, this guy's going to change the world. This guy is going places in public affairs. You're going to hear from this guy. There are individuals like that. Lyndon Johnson was famous or notorious for his burning, driving ambition. And people who saw Lyndon Johnson when he was a student at Southwest Texas Teachers College, where he went to college, the closest college to the Hill Country, now Texas State University. They saw this guy is going places. People saw Reagan, they didn't see that at all. In fact, as I say, no one would have guessed, knowing Reagan when he was young, knowing Reagan when he was in radio, knowing Reagan when he was in film, knowing Reagan when he was in TV, that he would wind up in politics. The reason he went into politics was I won't say he failed at the other things, but he no longer could do the things that he really wanted to do. He wanted to be a film actor, and his film career had ended. And now he is in his early 50s. This is the early 1960s. And he can't get any film roles. He loses his job as host of the GE Theater when NBC puts on this new Sunday night show starring Lorne Greene and Parnell Roberts and Bonanza. And so GE Theater loses out to Bonanza, and Reagan loses his job. He gets another gig as host of, remember Death Valley days? Okay, this was a lower budget version of GE Theater. And Reagan, instead of pitching the virtues of better living through electricity, is selling 20 Mule Team borax. But during this period, he discovered an interest in elective politics. He had gotten into the politics of Hollywood and as a member and then president of the Screen Actors Guild. And he discovered he kind of liked the back and forth, the give and take, the debate of being in that kind of position. And so in the early 60s, he started speaking on behalf of political candidates in Southern California. After all, he was an actor. He can memorize lines. He can give a speech. And he gave pretty good speeches. He was, until 1962, a registered Democrat. He had grown up a Democrat. He was a legacy Democrat. His father had gotten a job, a low-level job, in one of the New Deal agencies of the Democratic administration of Franklin Roosevelt, at a time when the family really needed for the father, Jack, to have a job. And so Reagan was grateful for that. But Reagan really never thought seriously enough about politics to develop any independent philosophy of his own. And more or less reflexively and out of loyalty to his dad, he voted for Franklin Roosevelt once, twice, 3, 4 times. But eventually, well, it was while he was working for General Electric that he started sort of rethinking his own philosophy. And he decided that his conclusions came down closer to the conservative side, to the Republican side, than to the Democrats. But he remained a Democrat, and he would speak on behalf of Richard Nixon. In fact, Reagan approached the Nixon campaign in California in 1960 and asked, I find myself supporting Republican candidates. Maybe I should just switch parties and become a Republican. The Nixon people said, no, stay a Democrat. You're much more effective as a speaker if you are a Democrat for Nixon. But eventually he did switch parties until in the 1964 campaign, he was a Republican. And he would go around Southern California giving occasional talks on behalf of Barry Goldwater, whose political philosophy was quite conservative, but whose demeanor as an individual was rather off-putting. Some of you will remember Barry Goldwater. And you'll know that Barry Goldwater embraced the extremism of his political views. You know, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, he said. Well, boy, he's just playing into the hands of the Lyndon Johnson campaign, who want to make him an extremist. And it's very clear that Barry Goldwater is going to lose the 1964 election disastrously. So there's a week to go in the campaign, and there's no chance of resurrecting the Goldwater campaign. But some of Reagan's friends think that they ought to get him on TV, and he ought to speak on behalf of Barry Goldwater. And it'll get Reagan's name out there, and it'll help the Goldwater campaign balance the books. They're very deeply in debt. They hope this is going to help them raise some money, so they don't all have to go to the poorhouse as a result of the campaign or to jail. So they say, okay. So Reagan's friends put up the money to hire a hall, kind of like this one. It's in LA, and Reagan is going to give a speech. Now, Reagan has been giving speeches to those lunch groups like the one I told you about at the beginning, and he's been sort of practicing for 8 or 9 years. So he's honed his talk, except that he's used to speaking usually at the length of a typical lunch speech, so 45 minutes. He's got 28 minutes. So he begins, and he's standing behind this lectern. And you can watch this on YouTube if you care to. So in fact, this is a really famous speech in the Reagan corpus. In fact, all you have to do is, do this experiment tonight, go on Google and type in "the speech." And you'll go straight to Google and you'll get that speech. I mean, straight to YouTube and you get that speech. Okay, so the audience, this isn't a real audience, these people are paid. They paid $1 to come in there and sit there. And as they walk into the auditorium, they are handed Goldwater for President signs. And their instructions are, when the speaker, this guy Reagan, mentions the name Goldwater, you lift up the signs, you jump up and down, you get real excited. Okay, that's what they're going to do. So Reagan starts speaking. And although he has been on TV and although he has been in film, it's clear that he's a little bit awkward. He can't find his rhythm because, well, for the last 10 years, he's been speaking to sort of real audiences that respond to what he says. And this audience, I say, it's not a real audience. This is his paid audience that got their instructions. So he's going through his speech. He knows he's got too much to deliver in his 28 minutes, so he talks too fast. And he sort of steps on his own toes as he runs right over his own applause lines, but nobody's applauding. And he doesn't, so there are two cameras. This is in an age when TV is trying to figure out how to cover political campaigns and political events. So there are two cameras in the room. There's one back there aiming at the speaker. So most of the time we see the speaker. But there's another camera over here that pans out at the audience. So Reagan is talking, he's talking kind of fast, and he's not getting the kind of reaction he wants. And it's clear that he doesn't feel comfortable with this, not feeling good about this. And the camera pans to the audience. And the audience doesn't know what to do because they've got their instructions. And when they hear the name Goldwater, they're supposed to react. Well, amazingly, Reagan is halfway into this half-hour speech, and he hasn't mentioned the name Goldwater. And so they're just sitting there, and you see him just kind of stone-faced with these Goldwater signs on their lap, and what are we supposed to do? But gradually they catch on to what's happening, and as they do, Reagan warms up, and it's really clear that this speech isn't supposed to resurrect the campaign of Barry Goldwater. This speech is going to launch the career of Ronald Reagan. This is Reagan's second screen test, this time for a political career rather than a film career. Reagan gave this speech a week before the general election. On the morning he gave the speech was advertised in various papers around the country. It wasn't a nationally televised speech exactly. What happened was it was aired in local markets around the country. And typically it was advertised, for example, the New York Times ran the ad in a column maybe 2 inches high on page 47 of section A or something like that. So you almost had to look for it. But on the morning before Reagan gave the speech, almost no one outside the narrow confines of Southern California connected Ronald Reagan, to the extent that they even remembered the name, with politics. That was the morning before he gave the speech. The next morning, after he had given the speech, there were Ronald Reagan for President committees being formed in various states. Republicans around the country watched the speech and they, oh my gosh, we've nominated the wrong guy. If we had nominated this guy, we might have a chance. Democrats were looking at this and said, oh boy, I'm glad they didn't nominate this guy. Anyway, so Reagan goes into politics. And it's easy to think from this remove that it was a straight shot from Reagan's film career to political success. I will tell you what I think Reagan's success consisted of. I think Ronald Reagan was one of the two most successful, and therefore I will say important, presidents of the 20th century. And I put it this way. What Franklin Roosevelt was to the first half of the 20th century, Ronald Reagan was to the second half of the 20th century. And here's what I mean by that. If you want to understand American politics during the first half of the 20th century, you need to understand Franklin Roosevelt. If you could pick but one president of that period that summarizes what American political life was about, Franklin Roosevelt is your guy. And what did Roosevelt's contribution to American political life and culture consist of? It consisted of pushing the pendulum of American politics, which never gets very far from the center. America is a very centrist country compared to other countries. It is almost never the case that anybody wins the presidency with more than 60% of the vote. And think of it. If you get 60% of the vote, it means 40% disagreed with you, didn't want you to be president. Anyway, what Franklin Roosevelt did was to push that pendulum politics to the left. He pushed it in a liberal direction. He embraced the principle that government is part of the solution to America's problems. And he gave it a good hard push so that the pendulum swung left through the New Deal into the 1960s. The Great Society of the 1960s of Lyndon Johnson was essentially New Deal 2.0. And Lyndon Johnson knew that he was operating in the shadow under the aegis of Franklin Roosevelt. And again, through the 1970s, when Lyndon Johnson, or the 60s, Richard Nixon was, in operational terms, a liberal. And by liberal, I mean someone who looks at the problems facing America and says, government is a large part of the solution. You are, in American parlance and politics, if you think that government is the solution, you are a liberal. And that was the thinking of most Americans from the 1930s into the 1970s. This was the thinking of the 61% who re-elected Franklin Roosevelt in 1936. This was the thinking of the 58% who elected Lyndon Johnson in 1964. But the pendulum goes only so far in American politics. And over the space of about 4 decades, Americans began to think that maybe liberalism, maybe government as the solution, wasn't all it was cracked up to be. And so by the end of the 70s, after Vietnam, after Watergate, after the stagflation of the 70s, people started to think maybe we need to try something else. Maybe we need to push that pendulum a bit back to the right. And when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, it signified that this turn was coming. And when Reagan, in his first inaugural address, stated very explicitly, he said that in this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem itself. So this inaugurated what I call the era of Reagan, the age of Reagan. And it's an age when people expect that government will screw up. Not that government will get things right, but government will get things wrong. That people become very skeptical of government. That people think that
The private sector is better at almost everything than government is. And I would suggest in very many basic ways we still live in the age of Ronald Reagan. Now, I told you that I thought the enigma is not what made Reagan tick, but what made Reagan successful. And I will tell you that he didn't have the characteristics one normally associates with sort of great accomplishment in world affairs. He was, I still have not, as often as I've talked about Reagan, I have not figured out how to say this without sounding demeaning to Reagan. I'm going to tell you, I do not intend to demean Reagan when I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Ronald Reagan was almost never the smartest guy in the room. Okay, well, needless to say, if you got a room of more than one, somebody's not going to be this, there's only one smartest guy. But I say this actually in a specific sense. One of the secrets of Reagan's success was his understanding that being smart is not the most important ingredient in being a successful leader, especially in politics. Reagan recognized, and this is something I observed in Reagan, I think he recognized it instinctually. I don't think he thought this thing through. But in politics, as in many areas of life, you have to be smart enough. But being smarter than smart enough is not necessarily a great advantage. Jimmy Carter. I have no idea if Jimmy Carter ever took an IQ test. I have no idea if Ronald Reagan took an IQ test. I'm going to guess, though, that if they did, that Jimmy Carter's IQ would be substantially higher than Ronald Reagan's. But Ronald Reagan was an immeasurably more successful president than Jimmy Carter. In some ways, Jimmy Carter's brain power worked against him because he seemed to believe that it was the job of president to master everything. And Carter was infamous for his micromanaging. And he wanted to master every detail of everything. However smart you might be, the presidency is too big a job for that. A secret of Reagan's success was his focus. Reagan had a short agenda. His agenda was very simple. He wanted to shrink government at home. He wanted to defeat communism abroad. That was it. Everything else was detail. I could go into sort of more of that if you want to ask questions, but I'll leave it at that for the moment. Reagan also understood the importance of the personal element in political success. I told you that story about the bagel at the beginning, and I asked you to sort of reflect on how you felt as you were sort of chuckling or laughing. And the reason I did was this, that Reagan learned, I think it was when he was on the speech-making trail for GE, that there is something very powerful about humor. That if you can get people to laugh with you, you're halfway to getting them to agree with you. But even if they don't finally agree with you, they are more open to your ideas than they would be if they think you are lacking in a sense of humor. If you've got a sense of humor, you've got a leg up on people who don't. The last thing I'm going to say about a secret of Reagan's success sort of brings us up to the present. You'll decide for yourself, it's sort of a negative way. Reagan was unusual in American politics. In fact, I would say he was almost unique in American politics, in that Reagan was a conservative and an optimist. Now, most conservatives are pessimists. For the obvious reason, conservatives, these are people who want to keep things the way they are. They're distrustful of change. Why? Because they think that change is usually for the worse. So we're just going to hang on to what we have. And I will tell you that in American politics, pessimism doesn't sell. Now, I will say that I said this with greater confidence 6 months ago than I do now. But I still think it's true. Reagan believed, as much as America had gone through during the 1960s and 1970s, that caused people to question whether America's best days were ahead, to question the American dream. And if you lived through the 60s and you lived through the 70s, it was easy to say, boy, America's best days might be behind us. Some of you will remember what was called the malaise speech of Jimmy Carter, where Jimmy Carter raises this question. Now, It's called the Malaise speech, even though he didn't use the word malaise. I watched the speech. I remember watching it. I've reread the speech. I think it's a really good speech. And I think he gets at some really important issues that maybe we can't do everything in the world that we want to do that we thought we could do. I happen to think it was a good speech. But it was, well, I think it was a good speech intellectually, philosophically. It was a terrible speech politically. Because Reagan understood that American voters want to be told that their world is going to get better. They want to be told that the American dream is as alive as it ever was. Americans want to be told that, well, basically, vote for me and things are going to be marvelous in the future. That was one of the secrets of Reagan's success. And I will say that this does not entirely speak well of Reagan, because Reagan was doing what politicians do. He was sort of promising the moon. But one of the striking things about Reagan's campaign speeches, and even Reagan's performance as president, was that Reagan, what shall I say, shamelessly flattered the American people. You know, when he said that government is the problem, government screws up, it's not the American people that are at fault, it's the government that gets it wrong. Well, wait a minute, this is a democracy. Who do you think chose the government? But he refused to make that connection. When Reagan was president, he promised tax cuts. He delivered tax cuts. His opponent, he promised spending cuts. He didn't deliver the spending cuts. And partly because spending cuts are hard and painful. Tax cuts are easy, and everybody likes tax cuts. Reagan never uttered anything at all like the sentence that John Kennedy did in his inaugural address, where he said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. With Reagan, it's the other way around entirely. You know, we're going to do everything for you. And this was one of the reasons Reagan was so popular. And Reagan understood that popularity can contribute to political success. So Reagan, I told you that his agenda consisted of shrink government at home, defeat communism abroad. Well, he didn't exactly shrink government at home, although he did slow the rate of government growth, and he did cut taxes. I'll say more about that if anybody asks me. He did accomplish the defeat of communism abroad. Now, I have to say this. He didn't do it all by himself. No president does anything by himself. Nobody in complicated issues does anything by himself. And I will also add that Reagan was the advantage of great good timing. Might even say great good luck, because Reagan entered politics in 1964. He was preaching the conservative gospel in 64. He ran for president in 68. He ran for president in 76. It was the third time, finally, that he got the nomination. So he was preaching the conservative gospel for 16 years before he became president. And it was his good luck that he lived long enough to be able to do it. In fact, the reason he ran in 76 to challenge Gerald Ford was he thought this was his last chance, because otherwise he'd be too old. Well, he lost, and he decided, well, okay, I'll break precedent and do it again. And he did, and he became president. But Reagan benefited enormously from being on the scene, being president, while two other people had careers that overlapped his. The first was Paul Volcker, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve during the period from 79. He was appointed by Jimmy Carter. And it was Paul Volcker who fixed the American economy. It wasn't Ronald Reagan. I mean, Reagan urged deregulation, but it was Paul Volcker who squeezed the inflationary expectations out of the economy. And sometimes against, more aggressively than Reagan did. Reagan tried to talk him out of tightening the money supply, because you'll perhaps remember, there was a very sharp and painful recession during Reagan's first term. If that recession had come 18 months earlier, Reagan wouldn't have been elected at all. If it had come 18 months later, he would have been swept out of office in the 84 elections the way Republicans were swept out in the midterm elections of 82. So Reagan's good timing helped enormously. The second person who made Reagan's success what it was Mikhail Gorbachev. Reagan wanted to talk to Soviet leaders, but he started with Leonid Brezhnev, and that didn't work. And then Yuri Andropov, and then Konstantin Chernenko, but as Reagan said, they kept dying on me. But along came Mikhail Gorbachev, who wanted to talk. And between the two of them, they were able to put the two superpowers on a glide path toward the end of the Cold War. You will remember, perhaps, Reagan's most famous single speech, the one where he's standing in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. And he says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And those people who look to Reagan as the president who won the Cold War, they point to that. What they conveniently forget is that when Reagan left office, the wall was still standing, as stoutly as ever. It wasn't until after Reagan left that the wall came down. And then you can sort of point back that Reagan says the wall comes down and the wall comes down. And now in Reagan's favor, I will say that all sorts of people who participated in the popular revolutions in Eastern Europe, they remembered that Reagan speech, and they greatly valued the fact that the leader of the free world, the President of the United States, was taking a moral position on their side. None of this sort of moral equivalency of détente that says peaceful coexistence is the best we can hope for. No, Reagan says, as he was asked his policy toward communists, simple: we win, they lose. And that was a radical position. Harry Truman didn't stake that position out. Harry Truman was containment. And Dwight Eisenhower didn't, and John Kennedy didn't. It was Reagan who won that says, we're not going to end in a tie. We're not going to keep this thing going. We're going to win. And he did. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because I want to leave time for questions. And you were going to ask me a question, right? About Ronald Reagan in the 2016 election? Please.
I would like to know what you think, how Reagan would react to not only the behavior of the campaigners, the candidates today, but also what issues do you think that he would be addressing today?
A very good question. So the question is, what would Reagan think of the behavior of the candidates today? And I will restrict it to the Republican candidates because Reagan as a Republican would feel a certain kind of obligation, responsibility for this. And also, what issues would Reagan address? And what would we think of the issues being addressed today? The first thing that I will say is, and I learned more of this about Reagan after my book came out. It came out in last May. And since the book came out, I have encountered all sorts of people who knew Reagan in kind of a casual way. I was in Los Angeles last fall, and I was being driven around, and the guy who was driving me, he was an Uber driver, and no, actually, I guess he's one of the black car drivers. And he just told me, because he asked me why I was in town. I said, we're doing some interview on Reagan. He said, I was a driver for President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan after they left the White House. And this certainly seemed quite plausible. And I said, so what'd you think of him? And he said, they were the nicest people I ever met. They, none of this, he said, I've driven Hollywood celebrity types who hardly even look at you. They think that you're there simply to make their life easier. He would talk to me about how my life was going, and he really seemed to care. And I've had conversations like that a dozen times with people who said, he's just a really nice guy. Now, I will add that they weren't his close friends, but they were people that he had encounters with. I will say this about Reagan's friends. There weren't any. Nancy was his friend, but Nancy was essentially his only friend. There was this emotional wall he built around himself. If Reagan had not been president, governor of California before that, no one would have come to his funeral. Nancy would have been there. The kids, I guess, they would have felt they had to. But he had no close friends. He didn't open himself up to anybody. But at a sort of day-to-day, on a casual basis, he was as agreeable, friendly, and pleasant as could be. Don't ask him to get too close, but he was a nice, easy guy to get along with. And this counts for a lot. And I will also say this, that Reagan was a consummate gentleman. And you would not hear Reagan would have been outraged to hear some of the kind of things that Donald Trump has said in this particular campaign. He would have been embarrassed for the Republican Party. And he would have been probably appalled for the country that a guy can get away with saying this stuff and be ahead in the primary contest. He probably would have asked himself, what has my party come to? So that's one issue. The other issue was, so what are the issues? What does he think? Now, one of the reasons that Reagan was acceptable to a broad variety of Republicans and conservatives, and I should mention, there were in those days conservative Democrats. And there was a substantial Democrats for Reagan bloc in Congress and in the voting public. Reagan was a conservative sort of across the board, but his true interests lay in what I will call economic and political conservatism. So he wanted smaller government, he wanted to free up the private sector, he wanted to cut taxes. He was against abortion, but he never took a high-profile position on it. He was sort of in favor of prayer in schools, but again, he never made an issue of it. Those issues, those social issues, have become a bigger deal for the Republican Party in Republican primaries than they were during the Reagan time. I'm not sure how he would have dealt with that, because they weren't, he had he had religious views, he had moral views, but he wasn't comfortable being front and center with that in politics. He thought that was something for individuals to deal with. So he was someone who focused on what he thought were the important issues of politics and economics. Yes?
What did he think of his cabinet?
What did he think of his cabinet? Reagan was a lousy manager if a good manager is one who knows what his subordinates are doing and keeps them in line, keeps them sort of on message, on the same track. Reagan relied on a couple of people. So he had a good relationship with his Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. He had a good relationship, he leaned heavily on his Secretary of State, the one who served the longest, George Shultz. But those two couldn't stand each other, and each was trying to undermine the other. And there was bureaucratic infighting, there was sniping that often rose to the level of public awareness. And there would be dueling leaks, one against the other, and Reagan would just say, you guys just work it out. Reagan was sufficiently confident in his own leadership skills to believe that that stuff didn't really bother him, and it didn't get in the way. Occasionally it did get in the way. So the Iran-Contra scandal of Reagan's second term was sort of testimony to what happens when you don't have a good chief of staff. Reagan had a really good chief of staff in his first term, James Baker. And Baker was sort of the consummate political professional. I interviewed, for my book, every surviving member of Reagan's cabinet and various other senior officials. And I have to say that I had never met James Baker before I did the interview. But I did an hour-long interview, and I wasn't with him for more than probably 3 minutes before I realized that this is exactly the kind of guy you want to run your White House. This is exactly the kind of guy you call in if there's a Republican candidate for president who is having trouble with a Florida recount, and somebody who's got a good political head, a good sense for the law. You remember, that's exactly, the Republicans the Bush family brought in Baker to do this. And I was very impressed. But here's something that I want to hear from the people that I interviewed without having to ask them. See, I told you earlier that I concluded that Reagan was smart enough, but not sort of blow you away smart. And I sort of suspected that the people who worked with Reagan, who in most cases probably, they went to sort of better colleges than Eureka, they graduated higher in their class, all this stuff, that I expected there would be at least a little of, he couldn't have done it without me, kind of thing. And my ears were tuned for the slightest nuance of this, and I didn't get a hint of it. All I got was enormous admiration and respect for Ronald Reagan. And I said, that if a leader in any organization can inspire that kind of admiration on the part of the people who work for him, then that says a lot. Another thing James Baker told me, and this was the best quote I got for the book, because this kind of gets at the question of how might Reagan fare if he were running today? Well, the first thing that I would say, if Ronald Reagan were running for president today, he would suffer under the handicap that he would be 115 years old. So that would be a problem. No, but if Reagan were in the campaign for the Republican nomination today, he would do really well. he would be leading the pack if, and this is a big if he had never been president of the United States. Now, needless to say, none of the candidates for president has been president of the United States, okay? So he would be in the same boat with everybody else. But the reason I say this is that, first of all, Reagan was a really good campaigner and a really good candidate. As I said, he is this conservative, and the Reagan philosophy resonates as well as ever among Republicans. Because Reagan the speechmaker, Reagan the candidate, would get 100% marks with the groups that sort of score the votes, or on the conservative to liberal scale. And he also was sort of an appealing guy. He could tell a joke, you know. He could tell jokes on the campaign trail. So when he got the nomination in 1980, and he's running against Jimmy Carter, and you'll remember that the economy was in bad condition, he used to say, a recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose your job. Recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his job. You'll remember that Reagan, in 1984, the question arose, is Reagan too old to be president? He did a very poor job in the first debate. And the Wall Street Journal, the Reagan-friendly Wall Street Journal, a banner headline said exactly, is Reagan too old to be president? And you remember how he dealt with that issue? He spontaneously, he had memorized this thing, and he dropped this one-liner into the debate where he said, I will not use my opponent's youth and inexperience against him. And in fact, so I've gone back and I've watched on YouTube the debate, and it's really interesting to watch and listen to the laugh that goes through the audience. Even Mondale had to laugh. But it's not a laugh of, ho, 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 that was really funny. It's a laugh of relief. Because if the guy we think might be losing his memory and his marbles can laugh about it, then it's probably not all that serious. Because it was a serious issue. What do you do if your president is losing his memory? And I will say that some of the people that I spoke to in the Reagan administration said that during his second term, he was getting forgetful. John Poindexter, who was the National Security Advisor at the time of Iran-Contra, the one who basically got thrown overboard when the story broke, he was convinced that one of the reasons that Reagan could say with a straight face, this is not arms for hostages, is he forgot exactly that he'd been told again and again, this is arms for hostages. So, there was a question in the back. Yes? Annette.
I'm just wondering if instead of looking at Reagan from the point of view of being intelligent or smart, you might look at him, his leadership qualities, as more one of imagination. He had a great imagination, he had great insight, instincts, and he had what my husband Russell Kirk, who wrote the book The Conservative Mind, said he had the illative sense, I-L-L-A-T-I-V-E, elation. So you put together all of these qualities of imagination, instinct, and such together, and you pick someone like Scalia. He's the one that picked Scalia. And here now we're hearing today all the wonderful tributes to him by both sides of the question. So in a common ground type of a project we have here, Scalia would fit that bill. Mm-hmm. And it was Reagan who did that. And right. So I think that one has to look beyond the kind of thing you were talking about, how smart he is or not. And also realize that when Anderson and the others wrote, remember they exposed his diaries?
Yes.
And showed how smart he was. What about those? Have you got something to say about his diaries?
I've read the Reagan diaries, and they show him to be more knowledgeable than his critics thought that he was. Oh, one other thing that the various people that I interviewed said, almost to a person, nearly everybody that I interviewed said what I'm about to say in almost the same words. And it gets to what you were just talking about. They said, you know, Ronald Reagan was smarter than people gave him credit for being. Now, I didn't quite know how to interpret this because I know that Reagan's critics did not give him credit for being smart at all. And Clark Clifford called him an amiable dunce. So if that's the bar you have to get over, that's not a very high bar. But I think that you've hit on something that, and I see this again and again. In fact, I have this theory of presidential leadership and presidential elections. And that, since I'm the one who raised the issue of IQ, and I think you're right, it's misleading. What I'm going to say is, I think, testament to the fact that it is misleading. I think that if we could somehow take the average score of the IQs of all the two major party candidates in every election from George Washington until Barack Obama, I'm going to guess that the winners have a lower average IQ than the losers. And what this says is that IQ is a very narrow measure of the skills that are required of presidents. You know, George Washington was a wonderful leader. George Washington was not an intellectual. George Washington, if he had sort of been in a debate with Thomas Jefferson or James Madison, would have lost badly. And, you know, Dwight Eisenhower was almost certainly not as smart in this sort of raw smart sense as Adlai Stevenson. But he was a much better president than Stevenson would have been. So, I agree with you entirely. How much time do we have, please?
One more question.
One more question, yes.
During his presidency, did he pretty much drive his own political agenda, or was he influenced by others, and who would they be?
The question is, was Reagan in charge of his own political agenda, or were there other people who were driving the agenda? I would say more than just about any other president I can think of, with the possible exception of Lyndon Johnson. Reagan knew what he wanted to do, and that's what he focused on. And so, now, I will say this. Reagan focused on just a few things. He focused on the federal budget, and he focused on foreign affairs with the Soviet Union. He paid little attention, for example, to the politics and diplomacy of the Middle East. And American relations with Israel during Reagan's presidency were horrible. And if you think that Barack Obama has trouble with Israel, Ronald Reagan had more trouble with Menachem Begin. And it was largely because Reagan was not a detail guy. And this is actually an important point, because if you deal with the Soviet Union, if you're president of the United States and you deal with the Soviet Union, that's kind of big picture stuff. And Reagan was a great big picture guy. His principles were, we're going to defeat communism, we're going to promote liberty, we're going to build up the military strength of the United States in order to force the Soviets to the negotiating table to get arms control agreements. And Reagan was really good at that. I spent about 3 chapters in the book on Reagan and Gorbachev at Reykjavik in 1986. And to a degree that surprised me, Reagan understood the details of arms control in a way that few presidents have mastered. But that was unusual. That was part of his area of focus. Reagan did not do well with the Middle East, because in the Middle East, more than most other regions of the world and parts of American diplomacy, the devil is in the details. And here's a good contrast. Jimmy Carter, as disappointing as he was in a lot of areas of the presidency, is the most successful president this country has had in the Middle East, regarding Middle East affairs, probably since World War II. And it was Jimmy Carter's attention to detail that led to the Camp David Accord, which is the singular success story in American diplomacy toward the Middle East. And it was something that Carter could do because Carter was a detail guy. Reagan couldn't have done that. But on the other hand, Carter could not have done with the Soviet Union what Reagan did. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience.
What a great audience you are. Well, I just wanted to point out a couple of things before we recess. First of all, you've noticed that there is a beautiful portrait up here of Ronald Reagan. And did you notice that he was smiling the entire time Bill was talking? Looking at him? That portrait is made available to us tonight thanks to David Bottrell, who actually took the picture. Please stand and be acknowledged. The second image that I want you to put your attention on is this image up here of President Ford, who looks a little bit more grim tonight. But President Ford and the Ford Foundation that represents him are great partners of ours. The Ford Foundation Library and Museum was instrumental also in this evening's program. So let's give them a hand too. And finally, I want you to be aware that just on the other side of this wall are books for sale, the Reagan book for sale, and Bill will be over at a table over here to sign those books. We are adjourned. Thank you so much.